Young Earth Creationism is precluded entirely by dozens upon dozens of well-known facts of the natural world, from the Radioactive Decay Law, the speed of light, and the nature of the geologic column, to the statistics that surround common ancestry, the fossil record, and our genetic relationship to the rest of the primates, mammals, and really just the entire tree of life. But so frequently I encounter what I am calling bite-sized busts, aspects of STEM fields that entirely preclude young Earth creationism that aren't typically talked about, but bust hard nevertheless. Be it geology, anthropology, astronomy, or physics, here we discuss the minutia of fields that leave young Earth creationism out in the cold. If you're new to the channel, don't forget to subscribe if you like this kind of content, leave a like and maybe a comment, and if you feel like supporting the channel in other ways, you can check out my Patreon, my PayPal, or stores. Hello and welcome back, my gentle and of course very modern apes, to another episode of Gutsick Gibbon. We're doing another bite-sized bust today. I'm super excited for it. You'll notice that I am of course not in my normal office, not in my normal space. That's because I'm visiting my parents, but that is not going to stop me from telling you, nay, informing you about how the massive hunks of rock and continent beneath your feet entirely preclude young Earth creationism. Plate tectonics are really kind of wild, aren't they? Our world is shaped by the slow processional movement of the ground below us, which is split into many different jigsaw puzzle-like pieces. These pieces, our tectonic plates, are constantly drifting atop the mantle thanks to the shifting of heat in convection cells miles below the surface of the Earth. This process began some 3.4 billion years ago, which, fascinatingly enough, is after the emergence of life on this planet. The movement of the continents, thankfully, is very slow. The movement of the tectonic plates was first described by meteorologist Alfred Wegener in 1902, where he called the process continental drift. He was dismissed by many initially, but by 1967, plate tectonics were deemed a real scientific revolution. Wegener represents one of the few examples in science where a researcher dramatically impacts a field of which they are not typically a part of. It should be noted that Wegener's observation was honed by dozens of other scientists who worked extensively to support the idea by collecting data and running analyses, one of the first true examples of data-driven science. So you may be wondering how the story of underdog Alfred Wegener and his wandering continents actually does annihilate young Earth creationism. What do these two things have to do with one another? And the answer is that continental drift, as it was known, and plate tectonics as it is now, both confirms the conventional and very ancient timeline and also rejects and really precludes the young Earth creationist timeline, and it does so in a matter of different ways. The problems are threefold. First, continental drift, and particularly seafloor spreading, act as an independent validation for radiometric dating. The second is that these plates have been moving for a very long time, forming supercontinents and then breaking up at least 7 times over. This process releases unfathomable amounts of energy across the past 3.4 billion years. Although the process is so slow, this energy isn't detectable to humans without our instruments and technology. The third is that if we cram all that unfathomable amount of energy into 1 year, the year of Noah's flood, as the young Earth creationists propose, we end up vaporizing the granitic crust of the Earth several times over. Young Earth creationism requires a spontaneous creation event some 6,000 years ago, as well as a global flood event some 4,400 years ago that is responsible for all layers of the geologic column from the Cambrian to the Cretaceous, as well as their fossils, every impact event or mass extinction signature within said layers, the current positioning of the continents, the state of decay of all radioactive elements, and finally, the various levels of diversity for all extant life. Young Earth creationists have a really odd relationship with radiometric dating. They will often admit that the process can be accurate for a few thousand years, usually in reference to things like radiocarbon dating, and this is so they can use the science they like to affirm the legitimacy of ancient biblical artifacts like the Dead Sea Scrolls while throwing the rest out. If you're wondering how this works when radiocarbon dating can actually date things as old as 50,000 years, the answer from creationists is that the process just kind of scales to 6K. It obviously does not do this. For radiometric dating in general, they tend to insist that the process is chock full of assumptions and thus will fail when applied to old rocks. Dates can only be reliable if radioactive decay rates haven't changed, the systems have remained closed, the rocks weren't overheated, and samples haven't been contaminated. And to them, that's a lot of ifs. You can propose the fact that multiple dating methods agree, and they may respond that it's possible decay rates just slowed down stepwise or proportionally. You could propose coral reefs, dendrochronology, limestone, and ice cores, and they'll probably just wave those away as well with various statements on fast-growing reefs, double annual rings, non-applicable experiments, or corrupted ice samples. None of these excuses are valid, but anyone using these particular excuses won't care. Luckily, I have covered all of these topics at one time or another, so feel free to check out why these excuses don't work using the links in the description that I definitely remembered to put there. We could discuss the nature of the Oklo natural nuclear reactor and how it also confirms that natural decay rates have not actually changed. But let's assume, for argument's sake, that none of these independent confirmation methods actually work at all. They're all garbage. Let's just go ahead and assume that. This is where we can turn to plate tectonics. When we look at a map of the Atlantic seafloor, we can make out an enormous underwater mountain range, the Mid-Atlantic Ridge, which divides North America and South America from Europe and Africa. The Mid-Atlantic Ridge is not the only mid-oceanic ridge, but for our purposes today, we don't need more than one. Magma wells up at this ridge, which is volcanic in nature, and adds new crust, thus continuing the division of these continents and the expansion of the seafloor. Now, the ages of the rocks along this ancient ocean ridge tell us a story. A data-driven story. The closer rock is to the ridge, the more recently it has welled up from the mantle and cooled into igneous rock, and thus the younger the rock is. As we move outwards to the continents on either side, the rock gets older with a maximum age of around 180 million years. We can measure the rate of separation of the continents by using radiometric dating. Dating rocks closer to and further from the Mid-Atlantic Ridge yields a rate of about 0.9 to 1.7 inches per year for the movement of the tectonic plates. This is further cross-checked with magnetic field fluctuations recorded in the seafloor. Satellite stations on each continent allows us to precisely measure movement, down to the scale of mere inches or less. In fact, when satellite measurements were first employed, they were lauded as a strong independent confirmation of plate tectonics. Since then, long-term measurements over the decades have given us a rate of movement at the Mid-Atlantic Ridge of about 1 inch per year, which is notably close to the 0.9 to 1.7 inches per year, the rate determined by radiometric dating. In fact, the numbers that we get from satellites are actually on the low end of the range obtained from radiometric dating. What that means is, at least in the case of the Mid-Atlantic Ridge, we're probably underestimating the ages, not overestimating them, which is not helpful for young Earth creationists. But that being said, this means that the movement of the tectonic plates both definitively and independently confirm radiometric dating as an accurate means by which to attain the absolute age of a rock. The second issue for young Earth creationists is the fact that these plates have been moving for a very, 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 very long time. 3.4 billion years, if you will remember. Now, recalling from our knowledge of young Earth creationists, they have to take 3.4 billion years worth of tectonic plate movement and cram it into the single year of the Noachian deluge, or Noah's flood. This means every time the continent split apart and every time it moved back together, for a total of 7 supercontinents, has to be crammed within that single year. And of course, if you've been around here for any modicum of time, you know that that has enormous issues for the third problem for young Earth creationists, all that heat. Because you wouldn't believe it, but just like rubbing your hands back and forth on each other very quickly makes your hands slightly warmer, a massive continent of rock scraping along the top of the mantle also creates a little bit of heat due to our old friend friction. Young Earth creationist organizations such as Answers in Genesis and the Institute for Creation Research both subscribe to the catastrophic plate tectonics model of getting the continents to move during the flood. Prominent supporters of this idea are Steve Austin and John Baumgartner, who suggest in their 2010 paper that the movement of the continents began at the start of the flood thanks to intense subduction, leading away to runaway subduction, wherein the plates were moving at speeds of meters per second, like literal race cars. Now, setting aside how ridiculous this is just as a concept, obviously the movement of the continental plates atop the mantle creates heat. And you may be wondering, Gutsick Gibbon, how much heat is it? And my dear viewer, my gentle, my modern ape, I did the math. And not just me, the creationists have also provided some numbers for themselves. And the prognosis is not good. Just the initial subduction alone proposed by Austin et al. Releases 10 raised 28 joules. This is not counting the movement of the plates themselves. A modern 1 megaton H-bomb is equivalent to 4.18 times 10 raised 15 joules. That means in initiating the catastrophic plate tectonics, they release the energy of 2.39 times 10 raised 12 hydrogen bombs. This is a little bit more than 2 trillion hydrogen bombs, and it's about 22 times the number of people that have ever lived on this planet. Every human in history gets their own 22 H-bombs. This is also roughly 10,257 H-bombs per square kilometer of the planet.
Uh-oh. Stinky.
Now, moving the plates along is another story entirely, and here is where we get to the math that I did myself. I am not a mathematician, so please let me know if anything that I'm presenting to you here appears faulty so that I can take the video down and change it and then get it back up again. According to Sweat in 2013, the weighted energy released each year by tectonic activity is 1.29 times 10 raised 19 joules. The plates have been moving on our planet for 3.4 billion years, and Young Earth Creationists suppose that all of this essentially happened in a single year. Taking modern observed rates and applying them backwards in time, we see that over the course of 3.4 billion years, 6.46 times 10 raised 28 joules of energy are released. This is assuming that the plates are moving as they are today, which may over or underestimate the actual value. So let's just be kind to Young Earth Creationists and half that number, which is 3.23 times 10 raised 28 joules, a number that is actually still even higher than the original subduction trigger value presented by Austin et al. In 2010. But Answers in Genesis and the Institute for Creation Research, to my knowledge, only accept Rodinia and Pangaea as previous supercontinents. So let's just go ahead and take 2/7 of that original number, which is going to leave us with 1.8 times 10 raised 28 joules, and we're still going to be boiling the ocean completely away 35 times over. Finally, this is ignoring all of the radiation and energy and heat released from accelerating the nuclear decay of all elements on the entire planet. So we can just go ahead and add 5 times 10 raised 29 joules of heat energy as well, which means that catastrophic plate tectonics, including runaway subduction, 10 raised 28, moving the continents, 6.46 times 10 raised 28, and accelerating nuclear decay, 5 times 10 raised 29, results in a total of 5.746 times 10 raised 29 joules of energy. This is just shy of the energy required for every square meter on the planet to get its own Hiroshima. This energy alone has the propagator of catastrophic plate tectonics, John Baumgartner, simply copying to the fact that the heat can't be mitigated without a miracle. In this way, plate tectonics simply annihilate young Earth creationism. There is no way to make this thing work, whether you're using Wall-Brown's hydroplate or CPT, as we were looking at here, without appealing to a miracle. And then it's no longer science, is it? Responses to this bust are going to be either, we're working on it, or it's miraculous. And I suspect the former will eventually throw in the towel and become the latter once they realize there really is just no way to make this work. And by throwing in that towel, we're going to see young Earth creationism take another one of its famous steps towards no longer being anything even remotely resembling science, and instead being a faith-based claim masquerading as something scientific. And so, my gentle and of course very modern apes, please do join me next time for another bite-sized bust to some big pseudoscience.